This is a story about a storyteller, the king's storyteller. Long before there was television or films or even printed books, if you wanted a story, you needed a storyteller to tell it to you. So I'm going to tell you the tale of one of those storytellers. His name was Isaac, and he'd been telling stories since he was a small boy. He'd started by telling stories to his friends and family. They loved them, and soon his whole village realised that Isaac had a very special gift indeed. He could spin stories all night, stories to lift you, stories to calm you, stories to amaze you, stories to amuse you. Isaac always had a story. His fame spread around his village, and to the next village, and eventually it reached the capital city, and into the palace of the king. Now, kings like stories just as much as anyone else, and when the king heard of this new storyteller, he decided that he wanted to hear his stories too. So the king sent for Isaac. "Come to the palace, and you can be the king's storyteller." Isaac was very excited. The king's storyteller? What could be grander than that? He'd be telling stories to the rich and famous at the king's banquets, dressed in fine clothes. He'd be rich himself, and powerful too, with the king for a friend. But Isaac was nervous as well as excited, because this king was a king you may have heard of. His name was Herod, and he was a hard man, a ruthless, cruel king. Keep him on your side and you'd be set up for life. Make an enemy of him and it could be the end of you. But Isaac couldn't resist the lure of fame and fortune, so off he went to Jerusalem and to Herod's palace. At first he was terrified, but soon he realised that as long as you told Herod stories he wanted to hear, he was happy. And what sort of stories did he like? Stories, Isaac discovered, about kings like himself, ruthless kings, rich kings, kings who got their own way no matter what, no matter how. So Herod was happy, and Isaac rose high in the court, rewarded with fine clothes and gold and a grand room in the palace. But one day something dreadful happened. Every morning when Isaac woke, the first thing he did was to decide on a story to tell that night. But this particular morning, no matter how hard he racked his brains, he just couldn't think of a single tale he hadn't already told. He tried to make up a new story, but nothing came into his head. No plot, no characters. His head was empty of ideas, empty of words. What could he do? Things looked bad for him. If he couldn't think of a story by that night, he'd be in a whole lot of trouble. The day wore on, but still no story came to Isaac. The sun went down, and Herod's court began to gather in the great hall of the palace, ready for that night's feasting to begin. Everyone settled down to eat and drink, but Isaac couldn't eat a mouthful. He had no idea what he would say when Herod summoned him out to tell his story. Finally the moment came. Herod clapped his hands together. "Isaac, king's storyteller, tell me a story fit for a king." Isaac stepped out into the middle of the room. His legs trembled in terror. Desperately hoping something would come to him, he opened his mouth. But just at that moment the door was flung open, and a servant rushed in with a great flurry of robes. "I'm sorry, your Majesty, I just couldn't stop them." "Stop who?" said Herod. "Visitors from the east, your Majesty, stargazers of some sort, but very finely dressed. They say they're searching for a new king, a baby king, a king who was promised long ago. They've seen a star that announces his birth, and they thought you might know where he was. I told them to come back another day, but they insisted. They're right outside. They're on the way in, your Majesty." Herod went crimson with fury. "A new king? Why on earth would I want to tell anyone anything about a new king? I'm the only king around here. How dare they? Are they complete fools? Send them away." No, on the other hand," he said, "don't send them away. Bring them in here to me." He looked around the room. "Not a word from any of you," he said, putting his finger to his lips with a wily smile on his face. Watch and learn. I'll show you what kings should be like." Herod had forgotten about Isaac, much to Isaac's relief. He stepped quietly back against the wall, saved in the nick of time. In came the visitors. Herod smiled his sweetest, oiliest smile at them, and beckoned them forward to tell their story. And what a story! They explained about the prophecies they'd read in their home far to the east, and the star they'd seen in the sky, a sign of the birth of a child God would send to bring justice and peace to the world. Even Isaac thought it was far-fetched, and he'd told every tall tale in the book. "What we don't know, Your Majesty," said the stargazers, "is where this child is to be born." Herod smiled at them again. "Well, if there's anything we can do to help noble gentlemen like yourselves, we'll be very happy to do so," he said. He summoned his advisers, people who knew the ancient scriptures. "Any ideas?" "Well," they said, "there are ancient prophecies that talk about Bethlehem, King David's birthplace. I suppose they could try there." "There you are," said Herod. "But be sure when you find him to come back and tell me. Of course, I want to go and welcome this new king too. Such a great day for our nation. Now stay and have some food. Stay the night. It's far too late to travel." But the stargazers wouldn't stay. They said they needed to travel at night to see the stars that guided them. So off they went. "No time for a story tonight, Isaac," said Herod. "And I don't think even you could do better than all that nonsense we've just heard." Isaac was off the hook. But as he headed home, he had an idea. He'd still need a story for tomorrow, or he'd be in the same trouble then. Those stargazers with their harebrained errand, surely there'd be a story in that somewhere. It would be a ridiculous story, but it might make the king laugh. After all, they were obviously complete fools if they'd come to Herod to ask him about a rival king, so who knew what they might get up to next? So Isaac slipped out of the palace and set out on the road towards Bethlehem. It wasn't long before he had the stargazers in his sights. They were moving slowly, laden with boxes and bags, stopping now and then to look into the night sky. "That's funny," thought Isaac. "There is something there, a star that seems brighter than the rest, one I've not noticed before." He shrugged and went on, keeping far enough behind so they wouldn't spot him. It wasn't far to Bethlehem, just a few miles, and the travellers with Isaac behind them soon arrived. He followed as they wound their way through its narrow streets, past the big houses. Surely the king would be in one of these. But no, they went on, till they came to a rather run-down house on the edge of town. There was no one about, just the light of that strange star shining above them. It seemed to be directly over this house. The travellers spoke quietly to each other. Isaac could see they were confused. This couldn't be right, could it? But then they heard a baby cry. There was a young child here. They picked their way across the filthy yard of the house and called out softly. From inside the back room, where the animals stayed at night, they heard someone call out a welcome. Isaac watched as they went in, lugging their boxes with them. He crept after them and peered through a crack in the door. What an extraordinary sight! Right where they were, amidst the muck and the straw, these finely dressed strangers were kneeling down. Before them was an ordinary-looking man and a woman with a small child in her arms. As Isaac watched, they brought out gifts from their boxes: gold, sweet-smelling frankincense, precious myrrh. What could make powerful, rich men like these kneel down in the dirt before a child? There was something extraordinary going on here. Isaac strained to hear what they were saying as they talked quietly with the child's mother and father. Something about God's love for all people. Something about justice and welcome. Isaac thought of the grand court where he'd made his home, of the power games and the fear, of Herod, cruel Herod, and the iron grip he had on the lives of ordinary people. And suddenly Isaac felt sick of it all. He leaned forward to try to hear better, when all of a sudden the door he was leaning on flew open with a great crash. Isaac went sailing through it, fell flat on his face in front of the mother and baby. Well, all hell broke loose. The pigeons in the rafters flapped around in a panic, the animals in the stalls bellowed with fright, and of course the baby woke up and began to wail. But the baby's mother just held him closer and smiled at Isaac as he lay on the filthy floor. "You could have just walked in, you know," she said. "You're welcome too." For the second time that night, Isaac couldn't think of a single sensible thing to say. So he just said the first thing that came into his head. "But I don't have a gift to give you," he said, looking dismally at the stargazers' presents. Then he thought again. "No, perhaps that's not true. Perhaps I do have something for you. In fact, it may be a more precious gift even than this gold and frankincense and myrrh, begging your lordship's pardon. You see, I'm a storyteller, and I have a story to tell you, a true story that you need to hear." And he told them about Herod, about his cruelty, and about the way he was trying to trick the stargazers into telling him where the child was, and about what he would do if he found him. They all listened with horror, realizing what great danger this baby was in. Thank goodness Isaac had been there to warn them. He was a messenger sent from God, they thought, just like the angels. And this was a precious gift indeed that he'd given. So at first light they all began to pack. The little family said they'd head to Egypt, far from Herod. The stargazers decided to take a different route home. There was no way they were going back to Jerusalem. They weren't that stupid. And Isaac? Well, he'd certainly found a story to tell, but he wasn't going anywhere near Herod with it. And the more he thought about Herod's court, Herod's world, the less he wanted to be part of it anyway. So Isaac just kept going, from village to village, town to town. And everywhere he went, he told this new story of a child born in poverty who came to show God's love for us all. Did he miss being the king's storyteller? No, because he still was the storyteller for a king. Only now he told stories for the King of Heaven instead of King Herod. And they say that he wanders the world still, telling that old story to anyone who'll listen. Who knows, it might be true. Or perhaps it's just the story that has travelled. After all, someone brought it to me, and I've brought it to you, and now it's yours to give away to someone else. As those old storytellers like Isaac used to say, "That's my tale, and now it's told, and in your hearts I leave it."